In the dead of winter, a woman carrying a suitcase walks through the snow-covered streets of Nazi-occupied Minsk. Guards stop her at a checkpoint, demanding to see her papers. Inside her suitcase, hidden beneath a false bottom, lies a Jewish child, drugged with sleeping pills to prevent any noise. The guards, satisfied with her documents, wave her through. This was Tamar Kaplan, not a resistance fighter, not a soldier, just a nanny who would go on to save 25 children from certain death during one of history's darkest chapters. How did an ordinary caretaker manage to orchestrate what would become one of the most daring and least known rescues of World War II? And why has her story remained buried for almost 8 decades? Before the Nazi invasion of Belarus in 1941, Minsk was home to over 80,000 Jews, approximately 1/3 of the city's population. It was a vibrant cultural center, with Yiddish theaters, Jewish schools, and a community that had lived there for centuries. Tamar Kaplan, a 29-year-old nursery worker, wasn't Jewish herself. Born to a poor Belarusian family, she had spent her life caring for other people's children, working in various homes and nurseries throughout Minsk. Nothing in her background suggested the extraordinary courage she would soon display. She was, by all accounts, unremarkable, quiet, diligent, and known only for her gentle way with children and her talent for calming even the most distressed infant. The German army captured Minsk on June 28, 1941, just 6 days after launching Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. The occupation was swift and brutal. Within weeks, the Nazis had established a ghetto in the northwestern part of the city, forcing the entire Jewish population into an area designed for maybe 10,000 people. Conditions deteriorated rapidly as food became scarce and disease spread through the overcrowded streets. The ghetto was surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards with orders to shoot anyone attempting to escape. Death became a daily occurrence, with bodies sometimes left in the streets. It was against this backdrop of horror that Tamar, who lived just outside the ghetto boundaries, began to formulate a plan that seemed impossible. What drove this ordinary woman to risk everything? According to the few surviving accounts, it began when she witnessed Nazi soldiers shooting a young Jewish mother who was carrying her baby. As the woman fell, Tamar instinctively ran forward and scooped up the child before the soldiers could react. Using her papers as a nursery worker, she claimed the child was in her care and managed to take him home. That night, as she cradled the orphaned infant, something changed in her. She later told a survivor that she felt as if God had placed this child in my arms for a reason. This single act of spontaneous courage would evolve into a methodical operation spanning months. By early 1942, the mass killings had intensified. The Nazis conducted regular Aktionen, operations where they would round up thousands of Jews for execution in nearby forests. Tamar knew time was running out. Using her position as a caretaker and her knowledge of the city's orphanages, she began creating a network of safe houses and developing increasingly ingenious methods to smuggle children from the ghetto. Her ordinary appearance became her greatest weapon. Who would suspect a simple nanny of orchestrating what would become one of the most successful rescue operations in Belarus? But how did she manage to save 25 children right from under the noses of one of history's most ruthless regimes? Tamar's methods evolved with each rescue. Her first extractions were simple. She would enter the ghetto under the guise of collecting laundry from Jewish homes where she had previously worked. The German authorities often allowed non-Jewish workers to enter for specific tasks, especially those providing services. During these visits, she would identify children who could potentially be saved. Her criteria were heartbreaking in their practicality. The children needed to be young enough that they wouldn't inadvertently reveal their identity, preferably with features that wouldn't immediately mark them as Jewish, according to Nazi racial stereotypes, and most critically, children whose parents were already dead or who were willing to part with their children to give them a chance at survival. In a testament to the desperate reality of the ghetto, many parents made the unimaginable choice to hand their children to this quiet Belarusian woman, knowing they would likely never see them again. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was one of the coldest on record, with temperatures plummeting to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Tamar used this to her advantage. Children were wrapped in layers of clothing, sometimes drugged with sleeping medicine obtained from a sympathetic pharmacist, and hidden in laundry carts, potato sacks, or even inside a specially designed suitcase with breathing holes carefully disguised as decorative elements. The freezing temperatures meant guards were reluctant to conduct thorough searches outdoors, often giving cursory glances to her papers before hurrying back to warmth. For older children who couldn't be hidden in containers, Tamar created a more elaborate system. She obtained chemical dyes and used them to lighten hair color, crafted false papers with non-Jewish names, and taught the children simple Christian prayers and customs to help them blend in. These children would walk out of the ghetto holding her hand, playing the role of her nieces and nephews coming to visit their Aunt Tamar. By March 1942, Minsk had become an epicenter of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. The killing operations intensified as Nazi leadership pushed for the acceleration of the final solution. The ghetto population was being systematically reduced through mass executions, deportations to death camps, and starvation. Tamar's operation faced mounting challenges. The Nazi authorities had begun to suspect that children were escaping the ghetto, and security tightened considerably. Checkpoints multiplied, and random searches became more thorough. On one occasion, a German shepherd nearly discovered a 4-year-old boy hidden in a false compartment of Tamar's bicycle cart. Only the quick-thinking action of spilling a vial of ammonia near the dog distracted it long enough for her to pass through. The risks were escalating with each passing day, but so too was Tamar's determination, as reports of massacres continued to filter through her network of informants. What makes Tamar's story particularly remarkable was her complete lack of infrastructure or institutional support. Unlike other famous rescuers like Oskar Schindler or Raoul Wallenberg, she had no wealth, no official position to leverage, and no international organization backing her efforts. Her network consisted of a handful of trusted friends, 2 fellow nursery workers, an elderly doctor who provided medical care for the rescued children, and a former school teacher who helped forge documents. The children were dispersed among sympathetic families in villages surrounding Minsk, with Tamar often telling these families that the children were orphans from bombed-out Russian cities. Some families knew the truth, others didn't ask questions. The operation survived on donated food, repurposed clothing, and the silent complicity of ordinary Belarusians who chose humanity over the ideology of their occupiers. April 1942 brought a devastating blow to Tamar's operation. A 12-year-old boy she had rescued 2 months earlier was recognized by a former neighbor who had collaborated with the Nazis. The boy was arrested and, under interrogation, revealed information about a safe house where 3 other children were hidden. The Gestapo raided the location, but miraculously, Tamar had moved the children just hours before, acting on a warning from a Belarusian janitor who worked at the police headquarters. This narrow escape forced Tamar to completely reorganize her methods. She abandoned the system of urban safe houses and instead focused on smuggling children directly to the countryside, often traveling at night through forests to avoid roadblocks. It was during this period of heightened danger that Tamar demonstrated perhaps her most remarkable quality: adaptability in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. By mid-1942, the situation in Minsk had deteriorated beyond imagination. The ghetto population had been reduced from over 80,000 to fewer than 30,000 through systematic killings and deportations. Those who remained were starving, disease-ridden, and living in constant terror. The Nazi apparatus had also become more efficient at identifying resistance activities. Collaborators were incentivized with food and privileges to report suspicious behavior. Against this backdrop, Tamar's rescue operation entered its most dangerous phase. She began targeting the most vulnerable, infants and toddlers from the ghetto orphanage who had lost their parents to execution or disease. These children, already weak from malnutrition, required immediate medical attention. Working with Dr. Mikhail Petrov, an elderly physician who had once been her family doctor, Tamar established a covert medical station in the basement of an abandoned church on the outskirts of Minsk. Here, rescued children would receive emergency care before being transported to rural locations. The doctor's involvement proved crucial, as many children were suffering from tuberculosis, dysentery, and severe vitamin deficiencies that would have been fatal without intervention. Tamar's methods grew more sophisticated as the dangers multiplied. She began using a series of coded messages with her network, passed through seemingly innocuous channels like laundry marks, specific arrangements of flowers in her hair, or particular phrases exchanged at market stalls. The network expanded cautiously to include a Belarusian policeman whose Jewish wife had been killed in the early days of the occupation, leaving him silently furious and willing to help by providing advance warning of raids. Most ingeniously, Tamar repurposed a Nazi propaganda initiative to her advantage. The German authorities had established a program where Belarusian women could volunteer as caregivers for orphaned German and Belarusian children whose parents had been killed in the Soviet counteroffensives. Tamar registered with this program, gaining documentation that allowed her to transport children orphaned by Bolshevik terrorism to designated orphanages. She would indeed take some non-Jewish orphans to these facilities, establishing her credibility, while diverting Jewish children to her network of safe houses. The psychological burden on Tamar during this period was immense. Later accounts from survivors describe her as developing a dual personality, maintaining a placid, unremarkable exterior when interacting with German authorities, while harboring an iron determination that surfaced only when she was among trusted allies. She never married and had no children of her own, dedicating her entire existence to the rescue operation. The constant stress and fear took a physical toll as well. Photographs from before the war show a round-faced woman with a ready smile. A rare image from 1943 reveals a gaunt figure with deeply shadowed eyes. Perhaps most remarkable was her ability to compartmentalize her fear. One survivor, Rachel Levin, who was 8 years old when Tamar smuggled her out of the ghetto hidden in a cart of hay, recalled, "She told me stories the whole time, speaking softly about magical forests and brave little girls. Not once did her voice shake, even when we were stopped at a checkpoint. I was terrified, but her calmness made me believe everything would be all right." In July 1942, disaster struck. A major Nazi operation targeted the remaining children in the Minsk Ghetto. Over 2,000 children were rounded up for immediate execution outside the city. Tamar, receiving word of the impending action from her police contact, made her most audacious rescue attempt yet. She and 3 members of her network positioned themselves along the route the trucks would take to the killing site. Wearing the armbands of Red Cross workers forged by her document maker, they approached the German officers supervising the transport, presenting papers that authorized them to select a small number of children for a medical research program, supposedly sanctioned by Nazi physicians. The stunning blend of official-looking documents, medical terminology, and the invocation of German medical authority created just enough confusion and plausibility that the officers, not wanting to contradict potential orders from above, allowed them to remove 17 children from the trucks. It was the largest single rescue of the operation, but also the one that would finally draw unwanted attention to Tamar's activities. The 17 children rescued from the transport became Tamar's greatest challenge and her most profound accomplishment. They ranged in age from 14 months to 12 years, and all bore the physical and psychological trauma of ghetto life. The older children were dangerously aware of their situation and therefore at risk of exposing themselves. Tamar split them into 4 groups and activated the furthest reaches of her network. One group was taken to a remote farming collective near the Lithuanian border, where a widowed farmer and his 3 daughters sheltered them in a root cellar converted into living quarters. Another group was dispersed among families in a cluster of villages to the south of Minsk, each child placed with instructions to pose as a distant relative sent from the city to escape bombing. The third group, consisting of the youngest children, remained under Tamar's direct care in a constantly rotating series of safe houses. The fourth group, 3 adolescents who could no longer pass as non-Jewish due to circumcision or other identifying factors, presented the greatest danger. For them, Tamar arranged a remarkable solution. They were hidden in plain sight as patients in the infectious disease ward of a rural hospital, where the Soviet doctor in charge kept them isolated under the guise of quarantine, with signs warning of typhus to keep Nazi inspectors at bay. By autumn 1942, The Gestapo had connected enough dots to suspect that a network was operating to smuggle Jewish children from the ghetto. They didn't know Tamar's name, but they had descriptions of a nondescript woman in her 30s who appeared frequently at checkpoints. Security measures intensified, with officers now checking the papers of every woman fitting that broad description. Tamar's response was characteristically resourceful. She began disguising herself as an elderly woman, stooped and shuffling, with her face partially concealed by headscarves. On other occasions, she masqueraded as a pregnant woman, using the padded belly to conceal documents or small medical supplies. Most boldly, she sometimes adopted the persona of a mentally disabled woman, exploiting the Nazi contempt for the disabled to become effectively invisible to them, as they typically avoided interaction with those they considered defective. This psychological insight, understanding that Nazi ideology made them see what they expected to see, became one of her most powerful tools. The cost of Tamar's work went beyond the constant danger. Her small apartment had been ransacked twice, forcing her to abandon any permanent residence. Her meager savings were exhausted on bribes, forged documents, and essentials for the children. She subsisted on whatever food her network could spare, often going hungry to ensure the children ate. Her health deteriorated as winter approached again, with a persistent cough that she couldn't seek treatment for, fearing exposure. Most painfully, she had been forced to sever all contact with her aging mother in a nearby village, knowing that any connection to her family could endanger them. A diary fragment recovered after the war reveals her mental state during this period. "I dreamt of the children I couldn't save last night. Their faces look at me from every shadow. I must focus only on those I can still reach. God forgive me for those I cannot." As 1942 drew to a close, the situation in Belarus became even more chaotic. Soviet partisan activity had intensified in the countryside, prompting brutal Nazi reprisals against villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters. This created both new dangers and new opportunities for Tamar's network. Villages under suspicion were subjected to thorough searches, endangering hidden children. But the growing partisan presence also provided potential new escape routes for older children who could no longer be safely concealed. Tamar established tentative contact with a partisan unit operating near the Naliboki forest, arranging for 3 teenagers from her network to be guided to their camp. The partisan commander, initially reluctant to take on non-combatant children, was persuaded by a Jewish doctor in their unit who argued passionately for their acceptance. This connection to the partisan movement would later prove crucial, both for additional rescues and for preserving the record of Tamar's activities after most documentary evidence was destroyed in the final days of the occupation. Winter 1942-1943 brought new horrors to Minsk. The Germans, facing setbacks on the Eastern Front, accelerated their extermination efforts. The ghetto population had dwindled to fewer than 9,000 people, many of whom were skilled workers kept alive temporarily for their labor value. The Nazis had largely achieved their goal of making Minsk Judenfrei, free of Jews, but their obsession with total elimination meant that children remained priority targets. Tamar's intelligence network, which now included a German clerk with an Austrian mother who secretly opposed Nazi policies, warned of a final liquidation plan scheduled for spring 1943. This information created an unbearable urgency. Tamar knew that any child not rescued in the next few months would almost certainly perish. Working with feverish determination, despite her worsening health, she coordinated what would be the most dangerous phase of her operation, attempting to save the last children hidden in attics, cellars, and secret compartments throughout what remained of the ghetto. The physical logistics of these final rescues pushed the boundaries of human ingenuity. Children were smuggled out in hollowed-out furniture, inside sealed barrels with breathing tubes disguised as handles, and in one remarkable case, inside a specially constructed coffin with a false bottom during a funeral procession that Tamar organized for a fictitious typhus victim. The mourners were members of her network, and the German soldiers, fearful of disease, kept their distance from the procession. This macabre but effective method succeeded in rescuing twin 4-year-old girls whose parents had been executed the previous week. Another method involved exploiting the Germans' fear of contamination. Working with Dr. Petrov, Tamar obtained medical waste from tuberculosis patients and used it to create convincing symptoms on the children, applying the blood-tinged sputum to handkerchiefs and clothing. Children were trained to cough convincingly, while Tamar presented papers identifying them as patients being transferred to isolation facilities outside the city. The Nazi obsession with disease prevention, particularly among their own forces, created a strange loophole through which several severely malnourished children were rescued. By February 1943, Tamar's network faced a devastating setback. Two of her closest collaborators, the document forger and one of the nursery workers, were arrested in an unrelated roundup of suspected partisan sympathizers. Under torture, the nursery worker revealed nothing, eventually dying in custody. The document forger, however, broke under interrogation and provided the Gestapo with Tamar's name and a physical description. Almost overnight, Tamar became one of the most hunted individuals in Minsk. Her photograph, taken from municipal employment records, was distributed to checkpoints throughout the city. Her former apartment building was placed under surveillance. With her identity compromised, Tamar made the wrenching decision to flee Minsk, knowing that remaining would lead to her capture and the unraveling of the entire network. Before leaving, she transferred operational control to Dr. Petrov and the remaining nursery worker, providing detailed instructions for maintaining the children already in hiding. Rather than seeking safety, however, Tamar embarked on perhaps the most extraordinary chapter of her rescue efforts. She made her way to the village of Katyn, approximately 50 kilometers north of Minsk, where her mother lived. Reuniting briefly with her parent after nearly 2 years of separation, Tamar explained her situation and her plans. According to her mother's post-war testimony, Tamar said simply, "I have started something I cannot abandon. There are still children who need me." After a single night, she departed for the forests where partisan units operated. Using the contacts she had established earlier, she joined a predominantly Jewish partisan unit as a cook and medical assistant. This new position provided her with an unexpected advantage. The partisans regularly conducted sabotage operations near Nazi transport routes, giving Tamar access to information about German troop movements and, critically, about transportations of prisoners, including children, from Minsk to extermination facilities further west. Working with her partisan unit, Tamar helped plan one of the most daring rescue operations of the entire war in Belarus. Learning that a transport of 200 ghetto residents, including approximately 30 children, would be moved by train from Minsk to Mali-Trostanets extermination camp in late March 1943, the partisans decided to attempt an interception. The operation was fraught with moral complexity. The partisans typically avoided rescue operations, focusing instead on military targets, and many fighters were skeptical about risking their lives for civilians who could not join their combat units. It was Tamar, according to multiple survivor accounts, who persuaded the commander by arguing that saving children was not merely a humanitarian act, but a blow against the Nazi ideology that sought to eradicate entire bloodlines. On March 31, 1943, the partisan unit derailed the transport train by detonating explosives on the tracks in a remote wooded area. In the ensuing chaos, as Nazi guards attempted to secure the site, partisans attacked from the forest edge. During the 20-minute firefight, Tamar and 3 other non-combatants moved through the damaged train cars, helping prisoners escape into the forest. Of the approximately 200 prisoners, 68 managed to escape, including 17 children. This operation, later nicknamed Tamar's Train by survivors, would be her last major rescue action. The aftermath of Tamar's Train brought severe repercussions. The Germans, furious at the partisan attack and the escape of Jews bound for execution, launched a massive search operation throughout the region. Villages suspected of harboring escapees were burned, often with residents locked inside their homes. The Nazi policy of collective punishment reached new levels of brutality. With the infamous Dirlewanger Brigade, a unit composed largely of convicted criminals, deployed specifically to hunt down escapees and partisan supporters. For Tamar, the weeks following the train rescue were a nightmare of constant movement. She guided several of the rescued children through swamps and forests to reach safe houses that remained operational in distant villages. The journey was harrowing, moving only at night, wading through freezing marshes to avoid leaving tracks, and maintaining absolute silence for hours at a time. One 6-year-old boy rescued from the train later recounted how Tamar carried him on her back for 3 nights, when his legs gave out from exhaustion, all while battling her own worsening tuberculosis, evidenced by the bloody handkerchief she tried to hide from the children. By May 1943, the German anti-partisan operations had made Tamar's position with the forest fighters untenable. Her persistent cough threatened to reveal their positions during hiding, and her deteriorating health made it increasingly difficult for her to keep pace with the unit's movements. In a heart-wrenching decision, the partisan commander ordered Tamar to leave the unit for the safety of all involved. He arranged for her to be taken to a remote farmhouse operated by a sympathizer near the border with Latvia, where she could receive basic medical care while maintaining her connection to the rescue network through periodic messenger contacts. It was in this isolated farmhouse, resting for the first time in nearly 2 years of constant danger, that Tamar began documenting her experiences and the names of the children she had saved. Using homemade ink on pages torn from agricultural almanacs, she created a meticulous record of each child, their original names, the names and locations of their parents if known, and the false identities and locations where they had been placed. This document, which she updated whenever messengers brought news of the children's situations, would become known as Tamar's List, a crucial record that would later allow many survivors to reclaim their true identities and, in a few cases, reunite with relatives who had survived elsewhere. Summer 1943 brought a significant shift in the war's momentum. After the German defeat at Kursk, Soviet forces began a westward push that would eventually lead to the liberation of Belarus. This changing tide created new challenges and opportunities for Tamar's network. Dr. Petrov, still operating in Minsk, sent word through the partisan messenger system that several safe houses near the city had been compromised as Nazi security forces, growing increasingly desperate and brutal as defeat loomed, intensified their searches. 8 children had to be relocated urgently, but with partisan routes now focused on sabotage operations rather than civilian movement, traditional escape paths were unavailable. From her sickbed, Tamar conceived an audacious solution. She dictated instructions for creating a false German medical evacuation order, directing the removal of children from areas contaminated by partisan-spread disease to a fictional quarantine facility near the Latvian border. The plan called for Dr. Petrov to pose as a German-approved Belarusian health official, authorized to transport at-risk Aryan children away from partisan territory. Against all odds, the desperate gambit succeeded. The combination of official-looking documentation, the Germans' fear of disease, and their ideological concern for racially valuable children allowed Petrov to transport all 8 children to safety just weeks before their previous hiding places were raided. Autumn 1943 brought a bittersweet development for Tamar's health and mission. A Soviet partisan doctor who visited her farmhouse refuge diagnosed her tuberculosis as advanced and unlikely to respond to the limited treatments available in wartime conditions. Accepting her prognosis with characteristic stoicism, Tamar redoubled her focus on documenting the rescue network while she still had strength. Working with the farm owner's daughter, who served as both nurse and scribe, she created a comprehensive guide to the rescue operation, including safe routes, contact methods, recognition signals, and most importantly, the locations and false identities of all 25 children. This document was divided into 3 copies, each entrusted to different members of the network to ensure the information would survive even if some were captured or killed. Tamar's foresight proved prescient. As the Eastern Front moved westward, the chaos of shifting battle lines, retreating German forces, and advancing Soviet troops created extreme danger for hidden Jewish children. Some families who had sheltered children fled westward ahead of the Soviet advance, taking their charges with them. Others, fearing retribution from retreating Nazi forces if discovered hiding Jews, abruptly abandoned their communities, leaving rescued children in precarious situations. Tamar's documentation provided the network with the critical information needed to locate and protect these children during the war's turbulent final phase. As 1943 drew to a close, Tamar's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The combination of tuberculosis, malnutrition, and the accumulated trauma of 2 years of constant stress had taken an insurmountable toll. Yet even as her body failed, her mind remained focused on the children. In December, learning that Soviet forces would likely reach her region within months, she began preparing detailed letters to the approaching Soviet authorities, identifying the rescued children and advocating for their protection and reunification with any surviving family members. She was particularly concerned about the children's legal status in the post-war period, knowing that without proper documentation of their true identities, they might forever lose connection to their heritage and any inheritance rights from their families' properties. Working through waves of fever and increasingly frequent bouts of bloody coughing, she dictated these appeals with precise details about each child's original name, birth date, and family background. Her farmhouse protectors, deeply moved by her selfless focus, even in the face of death, promised to deliver these documents to Soviet officials when liberation came. The bitter winter of early 1944 brought Tamar's final crisis, and perhaps her most profound moral test. In February, a messenger from the partisan unit arrived with alarming news. A collaborator had revealed information about 3 Jewish children hidden in a village, soon to be in the path of retreating German forces, known for scorched earth tactics. The children were in immediate danger, but with the partisan unit engaged in a major sabotage operation, no fighters could be spared for a rescue mission. The messenger had come seeking Tamar's guidance, not expecting her direct intervention. To everyone's shock, Tamar insisted on going herself, despite being so weak she could barely walk across a room without assistance. Against the desperate objections of her caretakers, she stated simply, "These may be the last children I can save. I must try." Bundled against the cold and supported by the messenger, Tamar left the safety of her refuge one final time, traveling by farm sled to the endangered village some 15 kilometers away. The journey, which would have been challenging even for a healthy person in winter conditions, was an extraordinary testament to human will overcoming physical limitations. What happened in that village would later be pieced together from accounts by local witnesses and one of the children involved. Arriving near dawn, Tamar found the village already in chaos, with residents hastily packing possessions as news spread of approaching German forces just hours away. The 3 Jewish children, siblings aged 4, 7, and 9, were being kept in the root cellar of a farmhouse at the village edge, their guardian having already fled in panic. Moving with surprising strength drawn from some deep internal reserve, Tamar organized an evacuation. Convincing a reluctant farmer to lend his horse and cart, with the promise that Soviet authorities would later recognize his assistance, she created a hiding place for the children beneath sacks of potatoes. As they worked, the distant sound of German vehicles became audible. In a final desperate gambit, Tamar did not hide with the children, but instead chose to remain visible, sitting atop the cart as a decoy. Her calculation was tactical and selfless. Knowing her illness was terminal regardless, she determined that if stopped, she alone would be captured, allowing the partisan messenger driving the cart to potentially escape with the hidden children during any confusion. The small convoy had traveled barely 2 kilometers from the village when they encountered a German motorcycle patrol, advanced scouts for the larger retreating force. What transpired next has achieved an almost legendary status among survivors of Tamar's network. As recounted by the partisan messenger who witnessed it, Tamar engaged the German patrol leader in conversation, claiming to be a simple farm woman evacuating root vegetables before the fighting reached her land. When the suspicious officer demanded to search the cart, Tamar began coughing violently, deliberately spraying bloody sputum that splattered the officer's uniform. Shouting about disease, she lurched toward him in apparent delirium, creating a moment of chaos and revulsion that the messenger exploited to whip the horse into sudden motion. In the confusion, as the Germans instinctively recoiled from the apparently disease-ridden woman, the cart broke away. The patrol, after a moment of hesitation, shot Tamar multiple times as she remained standing in the road. The messenger, hiding the children, managed to reach the forest and eventually delivered them to safety. All three survived the war. Tamar Kaplan did not. Her body was left where it fell, later buried in an unmarked grave by villagers after the Germans had passed. Word of Tamar's final sacrifice spread quickly through the resistance network. In a rare and poignant gesture, the Jewish partisan commander ordered a traditional mourning prayer said for her, declaring, "She was not born a Jew, but she died as righteous among nations. Dr." Petrov, upon receiving the news in Minsk, added a final entry to one copy of Tamar's documentation. She saved the children until there was nothing left to give except herself. The Soviet forces that liberated the region in July 1944 were met by Tamar's farmhouse protectors, who faithfully delivered her meticulously prepared documents. A Red Army Jewish officer who reviewed the materials was reportedly moved to tears, declaring, "When we account for what was lost in this war, we must also account for what was saved. This woman's name must be remembered." Yet despite this pronouncement, the chaos of the war's aftermath and the subsequent Soviet policies would conspire to submerge Tamar's story beneath layers of official history that emphasized collective heroism over individual acts, particularly those with religious or ethnic dimensions. Her extraordinary courage would remain largely unknown outside the circle of survivors and their descendants for decades to come. The immediate aftermath of the war brought a new chapter of challenges for the children Tamar had saved. As Soviet forces consolidated control over Belarus, the complex process of determining the fate of orphaned children began. The Soviet approach was shaped by both practical considerations and ideological principles. The urgent need to care for countless war orphans balanced against the state philosophy that emphasized collective identity over religious or ethnic distinctions. For the Jewish children hidden under false identities, this created a profound dilemma. Tamar's detailed records, which had made their way to Soviet authorities through her farmhouse caretakers, provided crucial documentation of their true identities. However, the Soviet officials processing orphaned children were often indifferent to these religious and cultural distinctions, focusing instead on placing children in state orphanages where they would be raised as Soviet citizens first and foremost. Some officials, motivated by lingering anti-Semitism or zealous communist ideology, actively discouraged efforts to identify Jewish orphans as a distinct group requiring special consideration for their cultural heritage. The surviving members of Tamar's network, led by Dr. Petrov and the nursery worker, who had evaded capture, faced an uphill battle in the post-war landscape. Working cautiously within the Soviet system, they attempted to ensure that Tamar's rescued children would be reconnected with any surviving family members and, where no family remained, placed with Jewish families or organizations rather than lost within the general population of war orphans. Their efforts were complicated by the brutal reality that for most of these children, entire extended families had been eradicated, leaving no blood relatives to claim them. The Jewish communities of Belarus and neighboring regions had been so thoroughly decimated, with over 90% of Belarusian Jews murdered during the Holocaust, that the traditional community structures that might have absorbed orphans had largely ceased to exist. Adding to these difficulties, several families who had sheltered children during the war had grown attached to them and were reluctant to relinquish them, especially when the children themselves had formed strong bonds with their rescuers after years in hiding. By late 1945, the fate of Tamar's 25 children had diverged along several paths. 7 children had been reunited with surviving relatives, parents who had escaped to the Soviet interior before the Nazi occupation, aunts and uncles who had survived in partisan units, or in one remarkable case, a mother who had survived Auschwitz and returned to search for her family. 8 children remained with the Belarusian families who had sheltered them during the war, with varying degrees of acknowledgement of their Jewish heritage. These arrangements were sometimes formalized through adoption, though in rural areas, such legalities were often handled informally. 5 children had been placed in Soviet state orphanages, where despite Dr. Petrov's efforts to maintain records of their true identities, The institutional pressure to create homogeneous Soviet citizens often resulted in the gradual erasure of their Jewish backgrounds. The remaining 5 children had been located by representatives of Jewish organizations operating under the limited tolerance of Soviet authorities, who arranged for them to be sent to newly established Jewish orphanages in Moscow, Leningrad, and later, the emerging state of Israel. The struggle to preserve the memory of Tamar's actions faced similar challenges in the post-war Soviet context. The official Soviet narrative of the Great Patriotic War emphasized collective resistance under communist leadership, with individual heroes celebrated primarily when they fit neatly into ideological frameworks. Tamar's story, a non-Jewish woman risking everything to save Jewish children specifically because of their religious identity, did not align with the preferred narrative of unified Soviet peoples fighting fascism without internal ethnic distinctions. Dr. Petrov made several attempts to have her recognized officially, submitting documentation to various Soviet historical commissions in the late 1940s. His efforts met with bureaucratic indifference or outright obstruction, with one party official allegedly commenting that highlighting the rescue of Jewish children specifically undermines the shared suffering of all Soviet peoples under fascism. Adding to the challenge, the increasingly anti-Semitic policies of late Stalinism made any emphasis on Jewish victimhood or rescue politically suspect. By the early 1950s, with Stalin's anti-cosmopolitan campaign targeting Jewish cultural figures and the fabricated doctor's plot creating a climate of fear, even private discussions of Holocaust rescue efforts became dangerous. The physical evidence of Tamar's heroism faced similar erasure. The farmhouse where she had spent her final months and created her crucial documentation was repurposed as a collective farm administrative building with no memorial or marker. The village where she made her last stand and sacrifice was rebuilt after wartime destruction, without any acknowledgement of the events that had transpired there. The 3 copies of her rescue network documentation met different fates. One was confiscated during a routine Soviet security review of war documents and disappeared into state archives. One remained hidden with Dr. Petrov, who feared political repercussions if it was discovered, and the third made its way through underground channels to Jewish historical preservation efforts outside the Soviet Union. This third copy, smuggled first to Poland and then to Israel in 1950, would eventually become the seed from which Tamar's story would be rediscovered decades later. Meanwhile, across Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, thousands of mass grave sites and killing locations remained unmarked, with Soviet authorities reluctant to acknowledge the specifically anti-Jewish nature of much of the Nazi genocide. In this climate of enforced forgetting and historical revision, the memory of Tamar Kaplan's extraordinary courage was preserved primarily through the quiet, private remembrances of those she had saved and their descendants. The Cold War decades cast a long shadow over Holocaust memory, particularly stories like Tamar's that had been subsumed within Soviet historical narratives. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the rescued children grew into adulthood, many unaware of their own histories or of the woman who had saved them. Those raised in Soviet orphanages typically received no information about their Jewish origins, while those who remained with their wartime rescuers often lived with deliberate silences or fictional backstories created for their protection during the Nazi occupation and maintained afterward due to persistent anti-Semitism. The children who had been placed in Jewish contexts, whether with surviving family members or in Jewish orphanages, generally had more access to their true histories, though even in these cases, the full details of Tamar's rescue network often remained fragmentary. Dr. Petrov continued his quiet mission of preservation until his death in 1962, maintaining contact with as many of the children as possible and documenting their post-war lives. His handwritten addendum to Tamar's original records noted with both pride and sadness that all 25 children had survived to adulthood, but that fewer than half know the name of the woman who gave them this chance at life. The first significant breakthrough in recovering Tamar's story came in 1978, when Esther Goldstein, one of the children saved during the Tamar's train operation and who had subsequently emigrated to Israel, gave testimony to Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims. Goldstein's account mentioned a Belarusian woman named Tamar, who organized our escape from the train. This brief reference caught the attention of a Holocaust researcher who recognized similarities to fragmentary accounts from other survivors. Over the next several years, through painstaking cross-referencing of survivor testimonies and limited available documentation, researchers began reconstructing the outlines of Tamar's rescue network. The challenge was substantial. Soviet archives remained largely inaccessible to Western researchers. Many survivors were reluctant to revisit traumatic memories, and the deliberate secrecy of the rescue operation meant that most participants knew only their small part of the larger effort. Nevertheless, by the mid-1980s, enough evidence had been assembled for Yad Vashem to posthumously recognize Tamar Kaplan as righteous among the nations, the honor bestowed upon non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created new opportunities for uncovering Tamar's full story. As archives became more accessible and restrictions on discussing previously taboo aspects of Soviet history lifted, researchers gained access to long-sealed documents. Most significantly, in 1993, a retired Soviet archivist came forward with the copy of Tamar's documentation that had been confiscated in the late 1940s. Having secretly preserved it rather than destroying it as ordered during an archive purge, the archivist had waited until after the Soviet collapse to reveal its existence. This document, combined with the copy that had made its way to Israel decades earlier, and Dr. Petrov's preserved records, discovered among his granddaughter's possessions, provided the most comprehensive evidence of the rescue operation. Simultaneously, the opening of borders allowed survivors who had been scattered across the Soviet Union and beyond to more easily share their experiences and, in some cases, discover for the first time the true circumstances of their survival. Daniel Kuznetsov, who had been 4 years old when Tamar smuggled him out of the Minsk Ghetto hidden in a laundry cart, learned the truth about his Jewish heritage and rescue only in 1994, at the age of 56, when a researcher tracked him down in Kazan, where he had lived his entire adult life, believing he was an ethnic Russian orphaned by conventional warfare. The most poignant development in Tamar's posthumous recognition came in 1997, when a reunion was organized in Minsk for the survivors of her rescue efforts. Of the original 25 children, 17 were still alive, and 11 were able to attend the gathering. Some were meeting for the first time. Others were reuniting after having known each other as children in hiding. The eldest survivor, Maria Abramovich, born Sarah Levin, who had been 12 when rescued and was now approaching 70, brought the suitcase with the false bottom that Tamar had used to smuggle her from the ghetto. She had kept it for over 5 decades as her most precious possession. During this emotionally charged reunion, the survivors collectively pledged to ensure Tamar's story would not be forgotten again. They established the Tamar Kaplan Memorial Foundation, dedicated to documenting rescue efforts during the Holocaust and supporting contemporary child welfare initiatives. In a symbolic gesture of enormous significance, they arranged for a proper headstone to be placed at the approximate location of Tamar's unmarked grave, inscribed with a line from the Talmud that had taken on special resonance in Holocaust remembrance. "Whoever saves a life saves an entire world." Despite these efforts at recovery and recognition, Tamar's story remained relatively obscure compared to better-known Holocaust rescuers like Oskar Schindler, Raoul Wallenberg, or Irina Sendler. Several factors contributed to this continued semi-obscurity: the limited documentation that survived Soviet censorship, the fact that Tamar had no descendants to champion her memory, the complexity of Holocaust remembrance in post-Soviet states, where competing narratives of victimhood and heroism often marginalized specifically Jewish experiences, and perhaps most significantly, the modest scale of her achievement compared to rescuers who save hundreds or thousands. Yet those familiar with the details of her operation argue that it is precisely the intimate, individual nature of Tamar's rescue efforts that makes her story so powerful. Unlike industrialists or diplomats who could leverage institutional positions, Tamar was an ordinary working woman with no special resources or authority who nevertheless created an entire underground network through sheer moral courage and ingenuity. As Holocaust historian Deborah Lipstadt noted during a 2002 lecture, referencing Tamar's case, in some ways it is easier to imagine organizing a rescue from a position of privilege than to comprehend how a woman of no particular social standing or wealth could achieve what she did. Her story reminds us that moral greatness can emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that the choice to act righteously was always available, even in the darkest circumstances. In the 21st century, Tamar Kaplan's legacy has slowly gained wider recognition, though still not commensurate with her extraordinary courage. A breakthrough came in 2007 when journalist David Fishman published The Invisible Rescuer, the first comprehensive English-language biography of Tamar, based on a decade of research including interviews with survivors and previously untapped Soviet archives. The book revealed new dimensions of her story, including evidence that Tamar had been briefly engaged before the war, but had broken off the relationship when her fiancé expressed anti-Semitic views, an early indication of the moral compass that would later guide her rescue efforts. In 2012, a Belarusian documentary filmmaker created 25 names, which traced the lives of the children Tamar saved, revealing how their paths had diverged dramatically, from a renowned Moscow physicist to an Israeli military officer to an American businessman who had only discovered his Jewish heritage in his 50s. The film won awards at several international festivals and brought Tamar's story to audiences who had never encountered it before, though distribution challenges in Russia limited its impact in the region where her actions took place. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Tamar's emerging legacy is how it challenges conventional narratives of Holocaust rescue. Unlike rescuers motivated by religious conviction or political opposition to Nazism, Tamar appears to have been driven by a simpler, more fundamental human response to suffering. The limited personal writings that survived suggest she viewed her actions not as heroic, but as necessary, the only possible response a decent person could have to the horrors unfolding around her. This perspective offers a powerful counterpoint to the often asked question of why more people didn't help Jews during the Holocaust. As Ruth Kleinman, one of the children saved by Tamar and later a professor of ethics at Hebrew University, observed, "Tamar never questioned whether she should help. She only focused on how." In this way, she shifts our understanding from asking why so few rescued to asking what specific circumstances enable ordinary individuals to act extraordinarily. This framing has made Tamar's story particularly valuable in contemporary Holocaust education, where her example is increasingly used to discuss moral choice and individual responsibility in times of collective violence. For the children Tamar saved, now elderly themselves, many with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her legacy is both profoundly personal and symbolic of larger historical processes of remembrance and reconciliation. At a 2018 ceremony marking the 75th anniversary of her death, survivors and their descendants gathered at the memorial established at the site of her final sacrifice. Sarah Michelson, granddaughter of one of the rescued children and now a pediatrician in Canada, placed stones in the Jewish tradition of remembrance and reflected, "My grandmother always said she lived her life trying to be worthy of Tamar's sacrifice. Our family now numbers 28 people across 3 generations, all of us existing because of one woman's courage. When people ask if one person can make a difference, I think of Tamar's 25 children who became hundreds of descendants, doctors, teachers, artists, parents, all contributing to the world because she refused to be a bystander." The story of Tamar Kaplan reminds us that history is not only written in grand geopolitical events, but also in the quiet, determined actions of individuals who refuse to surrender their humanity, even in the darkest circumstances. As Belarus and other post-Soviet nations continue to grapple with the complexities of Holocaust remembrance, Tamar's story offers a bridge between competing narratives, acknowledging both the particular Jewish tragedy of the Holocaust and the universal human capacity for compassion that transcends ethnic and religious boundaries. In a world still struggling with anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred, the example of an ordinary nursery worker who saved children not because of ideology, but simply because it was the right thing to do, offers a powerful reminder that the choice to act with courage and compassion is available to everyone in every circumstance. As one of her rescued children, now in his 80s, simply stated, "Tamar showed us that even in hell, angels can appear in the most ordinary disguises.